a little difficult to get motivated and go work outside, and it's a little stressful on us. It's stressful in our gardens as well. So I thought, well, this is probably a perfect time to talk about plants that are tolerant of dry conditions. Um, and so when we go through several different plants that actually do quite well under dry environments for both sun and shade. But like I said, before we really get into that too much, I also want to talk about watering. I know I have spoken about watering on this program with you many times, but again, this is a virtual plant clinic and it reflects what's going on at our plant clinic. And I'm saying probably 8 out of 10 questions, or at least 7 out of 10 questions I'm getting at the clinic, the problems I'm seeing, the diagnoses that I'm making, so much of this goes back to watering, which is, like I said, the most fundamental, most basic, but in some ways the most challenging and difficult thing to get quite right. So a bunch of stuff like that in store for you. Don't have a whole lot of content or material because I left lots of time for questions. So you can be texting those in, through the chat function throughout the day. And like I said, this is a conversation, it's a discussion taking place. So it reminds me of the Gershwin quote, it comes in summertime and the living is easy. Fish are jumping, the cotton is high. Your daddy's rich, your ma's looking good. So hush, little baby, baby, don't you cry. For some reason, I think about that and I realize, boy, that just couldn't be further from the truth for a gardener. This is not summertime is easy. Summertime is when it's the tough, the committed ones keep going. So when I see you in the garden center, I know I got a true gardener and applaud you for coming out to see us and keep working out there in the garden. So what I'd like to do is really talk about some real basic things regarding water. So all plants need water. Water's evolved, plants evolved out of the water and they require water. Just it's to varying degrees, some more, some less. So let me get my little pictures going here. So if you look at a plant, just very, very basic fundamentals on here, what I'm trying to show is that the function is essentially down in the roots. Of course, the roots are down here. This is where water, minerals, and nutrients are absorbed. And through a process of transpiration, that water moves up through here and evaporates throughout the foliage. So this transport of water, I think of almost like blood within our system. So it's moving nutrients and minerals from the soil up into leaves where photosynthesis can occur, and that's how the plant produces food for itself. It's also much in the same way that we cool ourselves through perspiration, plants cool themselves through transpiration. So when the temperatures go up, and if there's a little bit of a gentle wind blowing and stuff like that, that tends to cause the transpiration rate, the water loss rate through the plant can dramatically increase. So again, this is like I said, some plants will be more tolerant of dry conditions and they've adapted. We're going to talk about that, but just keep in mind, all plants are going to need some amount of water. If they don't get sufficient water, if this is a case of insufficient water, the first thing that's going to happen that you'll see is sometimes the color starts to fade a little bit. This is real subtle, but the plant is reacting. The roots literally send signals up to the leaves telling it, hey, water resources getting a little bit limited down here, time to slow it down. What we call the stomates, the cells where water is lost or transpires through there, they start to close up to try to conserve water in there, and the plant takes on a little bit of a dull color. That's not real noticeable, but then the next stage you start to see is, okay, it's starting to get really a little dicey here and the plant begins to wilt. Because again, it's the water, it's the moisture in there that gives it the turgidity and holds the stems and holds the leaves upright and in place. So those cells start to shrivel, the plant starts to wilt. If we really go much further than that, and we're at this point, the plant's under lots of stress, we start to get, we call this leaf scorch, where around the outer edges of the leaf, it starts to turn brown or black, most significantly. again, by this point, we don't want to get there. The plant's under a great deal of stress and it starts shedding leaves. Because again, this is a way it can conserve moisture. And so it literally just starts shedding those leaves off of there. Now, of course, all with this time, photosynthesis is slowing down. So there's less food production. Less food production means less growth, less productivity in fruits and vegetables. So this is all this downward spiral. And then ultimately get to where we start talking about branch dieback. And you start, that's when we're kind of in desperate scenarios. So just again, emphasizing that the water really is, I've heard some scientists say that like up to 80% of plant growth is determined by the availability of water. Now, the other part to this story is that too much water. We can go to the other extreme because the roots that we're talking about, they also need air to breathe. There's respiration taking place in every cell of the plant, which does require oxygen. So if this ground is saturated, if this root zone is just saturated, and all that pore space is filled with water, then literally there's no respiration taking place. There's because there's no oxygen available. The carbon dioxide gets trapped. And so literally toxins begin to accumulate and build up in the soil. And you can get to the point under extreme conditions where this soil is saturated for days at a time. This soil begins to become toxic. You'll see roots start to die off, pathogens move in. And then the symptoms that you start to see above ground is wilting. So this looks a whole lot like if the plant is not getting enough water, we're talking about a little bit of a loss in color, leaves start to wilt, and then that kind of progresses from there. So the idea, the tricky part in this whole thing is providing enough water to meet the plant's needs for transpiration, for nutrient transport, keep it healthy, turgid, and growing, but we don't go to the extreme of where it literally starts drowning. Now, we're talking a lot today. Most of the day, we're going to talk about plants for dry conditions. But I want to make a clarification with new plants. And this is why I'm emphasizing this. We deal with this so much at the clinic. New plants that are not fully established are handled very differently than a plant that's been in your garden for a growing season or more. When you're purchasing a plant, most of our plants now are grown in pots or containers. You'll slip it out of a plastic pot, and within that, you see this big, extensive, dense ball of roots that's there. So a new plant, you have this little small root ball. It's growing essentially in potting mix. It's a mix of bark and peat and other amendments. It's not real soil. And this potting mix can dry out and will dry out faster than the native soil that's in your landscape. So that's treated a little bit differently from a plant that is field grown. This tree is grown out in the field. And when you buy it, it comes basically in a big, tight, dense ball of clay. So clay is not a bad word. The thing with clay is when it gets wet, it holds that moisture for a long period of time, but because of the density, it's difficult to get water to penetrate in there. When you water that plant, the water is going to follow the path of least resistance. And I think what happens to a lot of us is we're watering that plant, but that water rolls off of that ball of clay. It rolls off into the nice, soft, amended soil that we planted it in, but sometimes the root ball itself can become dry. The flip side to that is, like I said, the container grown, which is in basically, it's a restricted root system, but it's in potting mix. So the water can go right in there, but then it doesn't retain it. It doesn't hold it for a long time. So a couple things that I really, really have to emphasize with new plants, things that were planted, if it's talking about little perennials, this might be something you planted in spring or this summer, or trees that might usually take a year or so to get established. But when you water, you need to water directly on that root ball. Rainfall does not count, because when it's raining, that water is falling all over the ground. It's watering the entire property, but that root ball that on new plant is small, is restricted, and it may not be getting what it needs. So it's critical we keep that moisture on the root ball. So I want to direct the water right on there. And then the other thing I was saying here is to check first. We can't tell by looking at the plant. I have this conversation over and over. I get pictures every single day, and I'm looking at photographs, we're talking, but you can't tell exactly what's going on down there. You can't tell because, again, wilting, yellowing, shedding can be associated with too wet or too dry. So when it's in doubt, when you have questions, the only thing I know to do, or to me, the best thing to do, is actually dig down in there beside the root ball and see what's going on. For an entire year, I ran watering demonstrations here at the garden center, and these are an assortment of different moisture meters that I tried out. Over the time, they all kind of have their pros and cons. At the end of the day, I'm not a big fan of a moisture meter. Most of them are calibrated to potted container plants. They're not really appropriate for landscape plants. What works really well is, now this is a soil auger. It's a specialized tool that we use that you can punch down in there. You can pull this core of soil up and you actually touch it, feel it, see it, and feel what the moisture is going in. So that's really great, but that's a very specialized tool. I don't think many of you are going to need to invest in something like that, but just taking hand trowel, and that's just taking a little hand trowel, digging down here 4, 5, 6 inches beside the root ball, feeling it. It should feel like a damp sponge, not soaking wet, not completely dry. And then, like I said, if we need to, we adjust our watering, keeping that water straight on the root ball. Or like I said, this is a, it was called a gator bag. There's about 20 gallons of water that you can pour into that bag. It seeps out very slowly over a period of like overnight, so that it has time to actually soak into the root ball. I found these were great on some of the field grown plants, but even like a little ginkgo tree, like you see in that picture, I would usually have to fill that bag up once. That kind of slides down around it, and then I fill it up and do a second one. And by the time I got done with that second one, it was really good and moist. So that's me preaching you about watering, which I know you've heard plenty enough about. But it's important, so I want to review that with you. And what we're going to do now with the rest of the afternoon is I want to talk to you about plants for dry conditions. With that qualifier, if you're putting a new plant in, you have to be responsible and attentive to the watering the first year. But once these plants get established, once their roots migrate out into the surrounding soil, you'd be surprised just how little they can get by with. So I'm going to show you Louis. A lot of you guys know Louis. He does some of our classes and workshops here for us online. I asked him to give us a little tour of some plants that he would suggest for dry conditions. So here we go.
My name is Louis and I work here at Merrifield Garden Center. And today I'm going to talk to you about some drought-resistant plants. And the first drought-resistant plant I want to share with you is sedum. Sedums are basically known as very drought-resistant. They are a perennial. They do die back to the ground every year. There are some that are actually ground cover, but there's also uprights as well. They're known for their flowers. They're known also for their leaves, for variation, and they're known for their texture. Some of the larger sedums can actually attract a lot of butterflies and bees during the summer and fall, and they basically can show some nice winter interest as well. The next plant I want to show you is epimedium. Epimedium is a perennial, so it dies to the ground every year and comes back. This plant actually grows really well in the shade. One of the reasons why I like it so much is it can grow amongst really large trees. The leaves are very nice on it. They actually have very thin stems. The flowers on it are very spider-like. And in the fall, the leaves turn into a yellow-orange color, which makes it great for fall interest. The next plant I want to show you is an annual called lantana. This plant has to be planted every year. It comes in all sorts of different variety of color. It basically is a bee, butterfly, and hummingbird attractive. Once the plant is established, you'll never have to water it. The next plant I would like to show you is juniper. There are upright varieties that mainly grow more straight up. There's also the shrub types that grow up and out. And then we also have the ground cover types that grow close to the ground. These plants are conifers, they're cone bearing. They basically have needles of different colors, and they also are extremely drought resistant. So they really thrive in hot sun and very dry conditions. Another plant that I want to show you is called the Japanese plum yew. The one reason why I like this plant so much is that it's extremely drought resistant, but it also does well in full sun to full shade. You can have this plant in all sorts of different forms. There's the columnar form, like this one here. There's also a form that runs along the ground. And then we have the typical shrub 3x3, 4x4 form. Another thing I like about this plant is that it's a needle, and there also are some varieties of this that the tips of them are a nice brilliant yellow. Thank you for joining me today. I'll see you next time.
Excellent. And welcome back, everybody. As any of you guys that know Louis have talked to him, he has a tendency to go on and on, but I gave Louis an assignment. I said, Louis, you can only have 5 plants. Otherwise, I said, we could go on with that for a long time. But those are all great examples. I think Louis is trying to show us that, hey, you got plants for sunny, dry conditions, shady, dry conditions, annuals, perennials, evergreens. So there's a lot of things that we can do. Before we get into showing any particular plants, do we have any questions coming in, Sally, or comments or ideas that you might want to share?
Sorry, we do. We have some questions coming in. The first one's about vegetables. This person has tomatoes and the leaves are curling and they don't see any pests, and they want to know if that could be caused by a watering problem. She has one tomato in the ground, one in a container, and the one in the ground doesn't have curling leaves, but the container does.
That's a good question, because I'm taking now, when you say curling, that's a little different than wilting that's on there. Because if it's a lack of water, or oddly enough, it's too much or too little water, I mean, you might see wilting, but it doesn't actually lead to that curling. Curling, that might be something we have to look at the plant clinic. That can be caused, there's a number of pests, tomatoes get mites that can cause curling on there. They can be, like I said, mites is probably number 1 on my list. I'm thinking we're seeing some leaf hoppers and aphids out now, that can lead to curling leaves. I'm not trying to think worst case scenario, but I have seen more troubles with herbicide injury, where people have been applying weed killers. I think this was earlier in the season when we were having strong winds, and that drifting over and contacting tomatoes and other plants. So we see damage like that. So I don't have an exact answer. I'd love to see some samples and maybe pictures at the clinic to narrow that down, but I think you're probably looking at more of a pest issue.
Interesting. Thank you, David. Next question is an interesting one. How do bog plants adapt and survive high water issues when other plants aren't able to do that? What's the difference that allows the wetland plants to have more?
And I love this this is stuff I love talking about, is the different adaptations that plants will have to exist in those conditions. There are some plants, if you think of like a bald cypress, big woody tree, but it produces those knees, those knobs that come up out of the water. Because what happens is, I was talking about the importance of plants having oxygen available to them. So what they'll do are these adaptations where, like in the case of like a bald cypress, these knees are actually ways that the plant has developed or adapted so it can get oxygen in a oxygen depleted soil condition. So like I said, aquatic plants do that to an extreme. Some plants are just a little more tolerant of low oxygen soils. So you see trees like sycamores or pin oaks, And interestingly enough, they just don't seem to need as much oxygen in the soil as some others. Those are the same trees that we put in our parking lots for really dense, compacted, poorly drained locations as well. I'm trying to think of some of the others. I think because I'm not a real specialist in aquatic plants, but they'll even develop where they're through their leaves they're able to get the oxygen that they need in that way. So most of them they're special adaptations.
All right, thank you, David. Next question is from someone who purchased 4 hydrangeas last week. She repotted them into larger pots, placed them on their deck, and gave them a good watering, and they had all wilted within a few days. Do you have any advice?
Yeah. So whenever a plant is above ground, if it's in a pot, if it's in a container, it's exposed to more temperature and moisture extremes of all sides and all ways. Also, because the way plants are produced, oftentimes they're on automatic or drip irrigation, they need constant watering. So most of these potting mixes that they grow in are intentionally developed for very well-drained soils and frequent watering. So in a container, a lot of times, like I'm finding a lot of pots that I have out there when it's 94, 95 degrees, that might be a time when they have to water daily. I know I was saying that we typically, if it's in the ground, we don't run into that. But your containers, I always like to make sure the containers have drainage holes so that excess water can escape and flow through them. But if it's in a potting mix, it's above ground, it's been 95 degrees out, it's probably just a matter of watering more thoroughly. And sometimes that's means slowing down the water a little bit so it doesn't just run right off the sides, but you actually water it to make sure it's going through the entire soil profile until it's dropping out of the bottom. And my pots and containers, I'm checking on a daily basis right now.
All right, thanks,
I
David.
think there's a plant that, most of that, depending exactly which one, most of them are pretty much plants that need moist conditions.
Yeah. All right, next question is about time of day for watering vegetable gardens. We got a few questions actually leading up to the program, and I've just seen a couple come in about whether or not there's a best time of day to water a vegetable garden. Some people have heard only to water in the morning. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, you'll never hear me use that word only, because that's just not the way gardening is. There's never just one answer. Now, I will totally agree. The very, very best optimum time to water is real early in the morning, even prior to the sunrise. But not too many of us are up at 5 a.m. out watering our gardens. Certainly not me. If you are, more power to you. The perfect scenario would be, hey, I'm hydrating that plant, making sure it's got all the moisture it needs. It's fully hydrated before the start of the day. And one of the things, this goes back to our conversation a couple of weeks ago about diseases. I'd love to get my watering done early, so as the sun comes up, it starts to dry any excess moisture that might be on the foliage. Because one of the connections that people talk about here is if the leaf remains wet for an extended period of time, all the diseases we talk about, whether it's late blight, septoria leaf spot, early blight, they all require a wet surface to infect the leaf. So that's why early in the morning is ideal. But I took these pictures out here. I'm going to say I do all this stuff the wrong way. I'm running late for work. I neglect to water my pots. I just lied because I told you I check them every day. I knew I was running late. I said, oh, we'll make it. I get home. It's 6:50 in the evening and these plants are dry. That's not the time to water because now I'm going into the evening. The plants are already stressed. If they're wet and they go into the evening, they stay wet. I increase the risk of disease. But you know what? The bottom line is those plants are dry and I'm not going to make you suffer through the night. You water, if you're in that situation, you water. If you water in the middle of the day, that doesn't burn the plant. It doesn't facilitate disease. It dries off. Those are like old urban myths, but it's kind of wasteful. because a lot of your water is evaporated, just evaporated. It's wasteful. So I'm talking all around this saying, hey, if you can, I want you to water early in the morning, as early as possible. Our temperatures are cool even before the sun comes up. So it's well hydrated, it's ready to go, alleviate any stress. But if your plants are dry, if they're wilting, or you find out or you discover they're dry, water them. I don't care if it's morning, noon, or night. Don't let them go through that kind of stress.
Thanks, David. All right. So the next question is, we have two that go together. Let's say two scenarios here. One is you've underwatered your plant. It has obvious signs of stress. It might be wilting. There might be leaves falling off. Can you rescue that situation? Two, you've overwatered a plant, or it looks like it's drowning. It's wilting. Can you save that situation? So how do you?
Yeah, a lot of times you can. And these are pictures I left out of my slides here today because I was in that scenario yesterday, as I said, through my own neglect. There's what's in the business we'll refer to as a wilting point. So the wilting point is when you actually see those visible symptoms, but the tissue is still alive, the plant can still recover, the buds are still viable. If that goes unchecked, if it goes where it doesn't get watered for a period of time, then there's what we've reached what was referred to as a permanent wilting point, which means, hey, no recovery possible. So I'm always telling people with most of our plants, behind every leaf there is a bud. So plants have adapted to where they can shed leaves, but if that bud is still viable and it's still juicy, it can still regenerate a new leaf and recover. So that's a fine line there between what we call wilting point and permanent wilting point. All you can do is get some water on those plants as quickly as possible and wait and see what happens. I was saying, and we've all experienced this, like in my case, hey, I watered them at 650 and I took pictures at 750 where they were starting to recover. And then by 850, they had fully recovered. So, I mean, most of the time, if we get on there right away, they'll recover. But if you left town and you were gone for several days or a week or something, you may have gone too far over that line and we're looking at a new plant.
Thanks, David. Next question is about fertilizing during the hot weather. Is now an okay time to fertilize pots and window boxes, or does the heat affect whether or not you should be fertilizing?
Yeah, I'm all on board with fertilizing. I fertilize all through the summer, but the connection that you're asking about, and that is important, is we don't fertilize a drought stressed plant. And this is where I think some of the misunderstanding comes from, because most of our fertilizers have salts in them, and those salts literally, we call reverse osmosis. The salts will draw moisture out of the soil and out of the plant. So if your plants are in a dry condition and you fertilize them, you've actually exacerbated the drought conditions. But if this is like what I'm saying, a managed landscape, if you're keeping up the water and you're paying attention to it, then that is fine to continue to fertilize and keep them growing. And especially like say at container grown plants, that's saying I'll mix, a little Miracle Grow or water soluble, some Peter's Classic or something. And I'm putting that on there, but not on a drought stressed plant.
Thanks, David. Okay, I just want to interject really quickly. We're getting a ton of questions coming in, which is great. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to get to all of them. So I'm going through now, trying to pull the ones that are mostly directly about summer, kind of generally, so we can cover the most people's questions. If we don't get to your question at any point today, if you're on Facebook, I would suggest you go to our website and send information to our email on the contact us page. If you're on Zoom, then hit reply and hit send. So just telling everybody we can follow up with you after class. Back to questions. So we have a question actually about mature trees, specifically oaks and tulip poplars. So this person is seeing dry leaves at the end of branches of some mature trees that they have, and they wanted to know if that's because it's really hot and dry this summer, or if they might have some other problem going on.
Right now, of course, damage from the cicadas is showing up, so it's a little hard to tell exactly, but you know, the cicadas that were out, you know, laying their eggs in kind of May, June, the female, you know, she cuts a little injury in there. She makes a little groove. It's a small twig and lays her eggs in there. So if you're seeing kind of like the, you know, 6-inch twigs kind of randomly dying, then that is probably a cicada damage, and those little twigs will drop off and no real harm done. We've really had pretty well, it's, you know, we've been wet, dry, but we haven't encountered anything that I'm really going to call drought condition. If we get to really dry conditions, then that yellowing and shedding is more random, is more scattered throughout the plant. So I think from your description, you're probably looking at cicada damage, and that's just a little anomaly and nothing to be concerned about.
Got it. And we actually had the same question about azaleas, but similar question, but the foliage is turning yellow. Is
Yeah.
that?
See, these things, again, this is why we have the plant clinic and love to look at it, because when you come in, I always say, hey, yellowing, shedding leaves, that's the same as if I go to the doc and say, hey, doc, I got a headache.
Yeah.
You know, and he'll say, well, why do you have a headache? I mean, is it because you're not getting enough sleep, or you're dehydrated, you know, or you getting sick, you know, is it something, you know, you ate? So that is a symptom of saying, hey, I'm stressed, but it doesn't really tell us why. Again, on established plants that have a root system that have been in the ground for several years, I really haven't seen any signs of like drought stress or anything. I mean, it was just really this past week has been hot, but it hasn't really been a problem. It's mostly with new plants. So if you're seeing yellowing, shedding leaves, I'd like to look at samples of that, because lace bug is out. That's a common insect pest that's on there. This also could be like a nitrogen deficiency. Plants put a priority in their new growth. So like azaleas that are pushing out their new growth and going to be setting their buds coming up next month, they literally will shed lower leaves to mobilize that nitrogen up to help support new growth. And so that could also be a case where they just need to be fertilized. So send us some pictures, stop by the clinic. It's a warning sign, but I don't think it's water if they're mature established plants. If they're new plants, you need to dig in the ground and check the moisture.
Sounds good. Thanks, David. For people who have a lot of container plants, is there a material that you recommend that's best able to retain water and help deal with these current conditions, like clay or plastic? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't know if there's a real big difference. You know, the terracotta, the clay does breathe, it's porous, and so they actually will lose moisture through the pot, as opposed to things like plastic that probably retain the moisture a little bit. That's not a huge difference, though. That's not going to make or break you. Thing that I use more and more of is I'm a pretty big fan of some of these self-watering pots. They're more expensive, but more and more styles and varieties come in. And essentially what they do is they have a reservoir. It might be 1 or 2 inch reservoir in the bottom of the pot. So it can hold water in there, and then the soil absorbs it up like a sponge through capillary action through there. Because otherwise I can't grow containers. I'm just not around enough, and I'm not attentive enough to keep them watered. So I'm gradually moving over those completely. Another little trick that you can use is there are polymers that you can mix in the soil. And essentially when you water, they swell up. It looks like a little ball of jelly in there. It looks like a kind of rock salt when you mix it into the soil. And so it will hold like 400 times its weight and moisture. And then as the soil dries out, that starts to release it back into the plant. So that's another way that you can cut down on the amount of watering that you have in there.
Thanks. That's a good tip. All right. The next question is still on watering containers. If someone gets up in the morning and they're headed off to work or something, and they notice that their container, the soil is still wet in their container, should they still water or should they wait?
I would probably wait. You know, there's a little bit of judgment goes in here, because again, a little small pot that has a little small volume of soil, that's going to heat up and it's going to dry out faster than a large pot. So again, bigger containers that hold more soil, have a more extensive root system, more water holding capacity, they're always going to, plants are going to perform better and require less moisture. So back to your question, there's a judgment that goes on here, because if you're talking about a little 4-inch or 6-inch pot and it's going to be 95 degrees and sunny that day, then I probably want to water that. But if it's like a 12-inch or 16-inch pot or something bigger, then I'm going to make the decision that, hey, I think I'm good, I'm okay for today.
Thanks,
Yeah.
David.
And hanging baskets, you know, they dry out even faster because they're up elevated out of the ground. So again, that's the thing that makes this so difficult talking about watering, because there's no one answer. You're always making judgments based on the information that's there. But I do like the idea. That's why I say check on them every day.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so here's someone who has an evergreen that has some reddish brown leaves in certain areas. Does that sound like something that could be a watering issue, or do you think they should bring it in and have a look at it?
Again, if it's a new plant, you know, where it doesn't have that extensive root system, or if it's in a pot or a container, then that very well could be that it went through a little bit of a dry spell or something causing that. But again, you can sit here and this must, and I've done this, you know, I've wasted, you know, I've walked past plant for 3 weeks trying to figure out, is it too wet, is it too dry, until I decided maybe I should follow my own advice and dig down the ground a little bit. And much to my surprise, it turned out, hey, I just needed to water. So if you're uncertain, just take a minute. And what all you need is, like I said, this is my favorite tool. This is just a little hand trowel. Just dig down there, you know, go down there like 4 inches or something and see what's happening. Because a lot of times, you know, I was working the garden the other day and the top 2 inches of the soil was moist, but then when I got down below that, it's pretty dry. So that takes all the guesswork, all the uncertainty out of it, and then you can make an informed decision.
Thanks, David. All right, next question. We have a few people asking about. So if their tree went through a time of stress, it started losing leaves and now they're watering it again, it's back on track. Will you start to see more leaves appearing at some point? How long does that take? Any general thoughts on?
Yeah. Oh yeah, you should still see recovery taking place. I mean, our growing season here, it's gonna depends a little bit on the species and stuff, but basically most of the trees are growing pretty well into September. By late September, October, they might start shutting down. So I would expect to see new growth and signs of recovery happening this week. Most of the time, you can start to see, like I said, if a leaf drops off, you can see a new leaf emerging out of there, you know, within a couple of weeks.
Okay, thanks, David. All right, next question. This is a good one. For how long is a plant considered a new plant, and is the answer different for containers versus landscape for purposes of considering it established?
Yeah, and that again, all these questions are kind of tricky because of the way I would answer. Established is really when the plant resumes its kind of normal growth rate. So one of the things that we know is that, and I use trees as an example, a field-grown tree, because that's kind of an extreme. We'll say if you take a tree that has a 1-inch caliper, that's going to take about 1 year to reestablish roots. 2-inch caliper, 2 years. 3-inch caliper, 3 years. So that's a tree, and it's going to take longer. And the more mature it is, the longer it will take to reestablish its roots and resume a normal growth rate. Whereas a lot of annuals and perennials that have a faster growth rate, a faster establishment rate, things that were planted this spring, I mean, they can have a pretty well established root system within, you know, 4 to 6 weeks even. I've had that. So it does depend a lot on the plant, its stage of maturity. It's one of the reasons I like small plants, because small plants generally, if you put them in, they'll establish quickly, and you know, and away you go. I'm thinking like that coneflower that I planted in my garden about 3-4 weeks ago, in little 4-inch pots and everything. I'm down to where they're getting watered maybe twice a week right now. Just kind of give you a little general timeframes there.
Sounds good. All right. So if someone, in this case, they have a container plant, um, and it's ended up, it's got so much water that the soil's almost like a mud. And so the container's not draining properly. Should you repot that plant, or should you put it out in direct sun and let it dry out?
You got a problem going on there. I think it's time to seriously consider repotting where something is either blocking the drainage hole, or I was helping a customer last, maybe it was 2 weeks ago at the clinic, and we're talking about a citrus tree that she had had for, I think it was about 11 years. And we're going through this question and answer and evaluation, trying to figure out what's going on. At some point, she casually mentions that she had watered it 3 weeks ago. And I'm like, what? Because I'm picking this plant up. It's just heavy as a rock. I mean, it's full of water. Water's still dripping out. And I'm like, man, it's been 3 weeks since you watered this thing. And then we get in the conversation on repotting, and it hasn't been repotted in 11 years either. And some of the things can happen is the organic material in the potting mix itself, it breaks down, it decomposes, the structure of the soil can change over time, at which point it's not draining properly. And so I do think most of the time we'd like to repot stuff like once every 3 years or so, to do like a complete soil change. So I'm saying these things because I don't know the whole story behind your situation, but the bottom line is something's going wrong there. And if it's a drainage hole that's blocked, or the quality of the potting mix is degraded, either way, the plant needs to be, you need to take it out of there, possibly get new fresh soil, double check the drainage holes, and get that problem corrected.
Thanks, David. All right, we've got a few minutes left. I've got a question here that is an interesting one. So this person, Peg, so for anyone who was on a class last week, Peg, I know, had mentioned that she hardly has to water anything in her garden at this point. So I know, especially during the summer, that sounds very appealing. So this person is asking, how do you plant to get to that point where you don't have to water very much? I know that could be a whole other class, but do you have anything you'd say briefly about low maintenance, low
Now,
water?
one thing is, I'm going to tell you, because I know Peg pretty well. We sit side by side and been working together for 25
Yes.
years. She's not telling you the whole truth. But Peggy is the queen of container gardens.
Yes,
So I
she
promise
definitely waters her
time
containers.
around watering her containers. But she also has an established landscape. It's in a shade garden. And so when I say established, she's been gardening there for 40 years. We are in a wet climate. I mean, normally we get 32, 33 inches of rainfall a year, and we'll get more than that a lot of times recently. So watering is generally not a big deal on established plants in our landscape around here. Having good soil helps, because when I say good soil, I want the roots to be able to develop an extensive root system. Plants have a ridiculously extensive root system below ground. So they're able to extract a lot of water from there, but it's when they're new, when they don't have that established root system, or where they're growing in pots and containers, we have to pay special attention to it. So the big edge that Peg probably has on you is she's just got a well-established garden. I mean, I'm in a little small garden, nothing like Peg is. I put a sprinkler on once this year. And again, because most of the stuff's established, I just go around and hand water the stuff that's recently planted.
Yeah, thank you. All right. I think we've got time for probably one more question. So I'll just go with one more about watering. This person says they've seen people using those, and I actually used to have this for a house plant that sadly got so big I had to get rid of it. But we've seen people using the empty wine bottles, and that's where you put them in, like my sister got me these, like the plant nannies.
Right.
Do those work well? Are they actually effective?
They do, but again, that's not a whole lot of water that's going in there. 750 milliliters. So if you're going on vacation or something like that, that might, depending on the size of the pot, the plant, etc., that might hold you for a few days. But I get people going away for 2 or 3 weeks and saying that's not going to be a solution. if you are going on vacation for extended period of time, I don't have good answers. I think the only thing I found that really works is having a good gardening friend that lives next door to help you out, or I've paid the neighbor kids, things like that. But I don't have a system that's going to get you through an extended trip or anything.
Yeah. Yeah. I know I used mine on a plant that didn't need that much water and it could go for a while, but definitely thank you. All right. So we're at 2:45. So just so everybody knows, if you all have questions, once again, please feel free, if you're on Zoom, hit reply to your confirmation email that goes to me. I will forward that on to David to discuss any questions that you all have. If you all are on Facebook, I would recommend that you go to the contact us page on our website and email us, which goes to another colleague of mine who I work very closely with. So we're both able to help you all get in touch with David or another member of the team if needed. David, do you have anything you'd like to close with before we
Well,
today?
I brought a whole cart of plants in here to show you these plants that tolerate dry conditions. But really, I wanted to just talk, so I'm glad we got to do that. But just real super quick, like Louis talking about the sedums, which are succulent. Again, the sempervivum, or the hens and chicks. I am more and more planting a lot of these in my garden because they've adapted where these leaves actually hold moisture in there. And there's an amazing array of those that are out there. I also want to remind people, believe it or not, prickly pear cactus is a Virginia native plant. Now in the wintertime, they shrivel up and look pretty pathetic, but there's plants here. So that's the other thing we didn't talk a lot about, but is the plant selection. And if you're going in a hot, dry location, like I said, there's lots of color and lots of things you can do. Next week, next 2 weeks from now, I've already got some plans lined up. We're going to be talking about summer flowering shrubs. Going to get back in some real pretty stuff there. So I hope you put that on your calendar.
Thanks, David. And quick reminder for some people who are asking at the end, this is live streamed on Facebook, so that recording remains there. You can also send me an email and I'm happy to provide you all with a link to that. And I'm going to be getting Louis' video to post that as well. So David, thank you so much. I see some notes coming in. Thank you all for those notes as well. And everybody have a great afternoon, and we'll look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks. Have a good day. Bye, David.
Bye-bye.